I'm joined by Ken Morrison from the Property Council of Australia to discuss their proposal to the federal government for a housing supply deal. The proposal has been designed to address rapidly growing residential supply bottlenecks that are emerging across the post-pandemic economy. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Developer, Ken.
My pleasure, Adam.
Now, the PCA suggests that a housing supply deal can smash supply bottlenecks around the country. What is the proposal and how will it live up to this claim?
Well, we've currently got a federal parliamentary inquiry into housing affordability and housing supply. And this is asking the question, what can a federal government do to address housing supply and housing affordability issues? And what we've said is, yes, the federal government isn't responsible directly for planning and land use and on-the-ground infrastructure provision, but it can come up with a bilateral agreement with each of the state and territories to supercharge housing supply by identifying all those blockages that exist in key housing corridors and co-funding getting those issues solved. So, where we are as a country at the moment is housing affordability is a big issue. We know that we have real housing supply bottlenecks in several of our cities. And here we are turning on, restarting net overseas migration again. So we know that population growth pressure is about to emerge in the coming years. So this is a policy that would get ahead of that, mean that the federal government can supercharge that supply framework, address supply bottlenecks before they happen, and do something very substantial to alleviate housing affordability.
So in some of the evidence that I think you put forward to the government, you demonstrated these specific gaps in the supply pipeline. What and where are they? And I guess what is the intensity of some of those bottlenecks?
You want to take two of our cities. So Southeast Queensland has had this amazing population shift through the pandemic, and that's meant that that's sucked up multiple years of housing supply in key corridors. So in some corridors, we've gone from a situation where 2 years ago we had 10 years of supply now to being only 2 years supply and a real acute shortages. The blockages there are really around getting the land rezoned, but also then getting the funding in place for that supportive on-the-ground infrastructure that's necessary to make housing happen. And we're going to really need that quick smart. But if we take 2 years to do that, then we're going to be out of land supply in key corridors. In Sydney, we've got a different type of problem where we've still got a very complex planning system. And despite lots of good intents from the New South Wales government, that complexity still remains. And what we think we need there is a supercharging of that focus from the New South Wales government, with the encouragement and support of the federal government to address that planning complexity. So, two different cities, two different dimensions, but both with an acute need.
Yeah. And so how would this housing supply deal in practice bring together the federal, state and local governments all in one to really, in a speedy way, unlock that supply?
Well, look, we would envisage the federal government saying, here's an amount of money that's available, announce an intention to do a bilateral agreement with each of the state and territories, particularly Queensland and New South Wales for the reasons I just outlined, and then have a team that goes in and works with that state government, identifying in rapid form, those key barriers and then getting those solutions in place. So this is something that could be rolled out, have a 6-month work through and then result in tangible outcomes in making available land supply and usable land supply, fast tracking those planning horizons. So we see it occurring like that. That means that from a federal government's perspective, they can enter what will be a federal election year in 2022, saying that they are doing something very substantial about housing supply, recognising that the population growth pressures are about to re-emerge.
And I guess what's the reception been like? What sort of impact do you think your proposal will be having on the federal election? Is it something that's likely to be taken up? Have you got any indications just yet in terms of the appetite?
Well, government's listening. I think it's good that the Parliament is conducting the review into housing affordability and housing supply. We feel we've got a fair hearing from the committee last week. So we're hopeful. Like all these things, Adam, you've got to keep on the case and continue to prosecute the need for these things. But we've had a lot of talk about housing affordability in Australia over a lot of years. And one thing we know, and particularly in the property industry, we know that the fundamental thing to address is housing supply. Interest rates will do their own thing. Hopefully employment stays up, so that will do its own thing. We know the population growth will re-emerge. So what can we do? What can policymakers do? What is their job to control? Well, it is that housing supply. And yes, state governments and local governments should be addressing these, but the reality is there's not enough focus on it at this stage. So we think it makes sense, given the national level priority that housing affordability is, that we have that federal focus and we bring their grunt to bear on smashing through some of these housing supply barriers.
Yeah. And just on sort of the difference between the land and greenfield sort of development sector and inner city apartments and high density, is there a view on how much of the pie of supply gets divvied that way? Have you got a view on that within the proposal?
Yeah, look, I think on an ongoing basis, the good strategic approach for a federal government is to leverage money that it already doles out for housing affordability and for social housing, and that's through the housing and homelessness partnership agreement, which is up for renegotiation in 2023. At the moment, the federal government just hands that money out without any strings attached, without any requirements for there to be an increase in the stock of social and affordable housing, and no requirements on the states to run their land use planning systems efficiently. So we would see housing supply deals as a way to supercharge housing supply with a more predominant focus on greenfields, and then addressing that housing homelessness partnership agreement as the way to lock in those reforms. So a two-step process to make sure that the federal government is not on the ground doing land use planning or approving DAs. That's not their job, but that they know that there is a strategic framework which encourages the states to do the right thing. And that it's that sort of strategic incentive that is used well in some parts of our federation, but isn't used well in this part.
And I guess how much intention is there or appetite is there from your members to really put their foot on the accelerator and deliver the supply, provided those bottlenecks start to sort of release over time?
Well, I think the proof of the pudding has been the pandemic experience. Once that incentive was there with Home Builder, which was a very, very important policy, that our members really responded. They're working flat out with their partners to get that housing supply to the market. I talked about Southeast Queensland. It's another great example where really the market has brought forward a lot of supply. We've seen that happen in Perth as well. And supply levels in Melbourne, our most heavily affected city in the pandemic, have also been strong. So if you put the right public policy frameworks in place, you make sure there's good competition in the market, then this industry will deliver. That's what we do. What we just need is to make sure that we've got the supportive approaches to planning and infrastructure provision to deliver that supply. And then we don't fall into this trap that we've seen so often in Australia, where demand moves ahead very quickly and the supply frameworks, all those planning and infrastructure decisions, is way too slow and drags back the industry's ability to deliver housing supply at the speed we need it and also at the price we need it.
And Ken, if you're a betting man, when would you say the federal election's likely to come?
Well, it's definitely next calendar year. The pundits seem to be narrowing on May. The real answer is the Prime Minister will go when he thinks he can win.
Fantastic. Ken, thanks for joining us and thanks for your work, and we'll keep watching.
Thanks, Adam.
Cheers.